Svanna and the Bird. Svanna remained in the garden, kept pure, waiting for her brother. The garden is the pure space, the space of bounty, of the diversity of balanced manifestation. It is a space where the stern may grow, the solemn place to which the stern must reach. The girl sat, playing in the smooth-grained white sand of a beach. Her skin absorbed the warmth of the sun, and she lifted her head to mark a sound. A great bird had landed with wings outstretched. As a bird, it was strange to her. She had never seen one like it before, and she was used to birds. The trees were filled with them, some dull, some rich, some brightly colored, but none sang to her quite as this one did now. The bird's breast became broad, sought to match its span of wing, and it seemed that its neck doubled in length as it lifted its voice upwards as if to the sky, and then back down again to her. Its voice was at once deep and light, a subtle melody suggested from just a phrase of music, and all the time it returned its gaze to her as though expecting a reply. She looked around at the beach, but she was alone with the strange, expectant bird. For some time she remained still, not knowing how to respond, careful and wary. But still the bird remained, watching her, then looking about, then preening, then singing again. The girl rose to her feet. Before her, behind the bird, the waves of a calm sea lapped at the beach. The water was clear, sunlight reflected from sand that spread beneath the water surface before dropping away to meet a reef some lengths offshore. It was as if the bird was a foreigner, a halfway point, halfway between her world of the open beach and his world, the space from which he had come. With his wings stretched, she saw feathers of remarkable hue exposed beneath others, but then he drew them in, folded them to his side, but always looked to her. The girl stood, nakedly faced the bird, not knowing his meaning, but calmed by his stillness. Her trust grew, and as though the bird sensed her confidence, he stepped towards her with but a light movement of one and then the other of his feet. His eyes were piercing, and as old as hers were young. The sun behind her fell fully upon her shoulders and lower back. It fell like a fall of water over her legs. His call now resounded within her, and she felt each time as though she had smelled some rich perfume after brushing past a fragrant flower. Her skin tingled with the steady gaze of his eyes, as though they touched her, as though his simple gaze reached out from his eyes and by way of a million silken threads explored all of what he could see. Her face, from her forehead, over her nose and cheeks, to her lips and chin, felt his gaze as if it were a warm breeze sweeping slowly past. Her neck to her shoulders and chest, her breasts and ribs, her abdomen from high to low felt the delicate wave of his invisible touch. It continued over her hips to her thighs, over her knees to cascade over her feet and toes, and within a silent sensation that caused her eyes to close. She rested, sandwiched between the warming reach of the sun behind her and the enveloping reach of the bird before her. Suddenly aware, she prized herself from the state, remembered to fear the unknown, but the bird still stood unmoving. She stepped back one step, as if an experiment, to see the result, but partly out of fear. And then his head thrust forward, skyward, his wings outstretched. His voice rang out again as brilliant feathers gleamed in the light, and then receded again with his voice. But in that time the girl had been engulfed. His voice had surged through her as if she were a sieve to water. Her mind swam with the passage of the sound, and as his gaze fell upon her once again, her body from the inside out seemed to liquefy. Tiny sparkling beads of perspiration appeared over her skin, and her strength deserted her. She sank to her knees in the sand where she had stood, her hands reached out before her for support. The fine white sand appeared as powdery crystals against her skin. Her eyes paused for a moment upon her hands as she moved her fingers through it. And then again she looked up, and although she had not seen it move, the bird was before her. Her nakedness was nothing to his gaze. She knew that he knew her, and she accepted him into her space. The bird leaned forward, again extending his neck, but this time he did not sing. Instead he leaned downwards, stroked his feathered cheek against her thigh. Without thought she raised her hand, extended 2 fingers, and with the gentlest touch stroked the soft feathers of his neck. She repeated the gesture, and his head remained still where it had stopped, resting on her lap in the cleft where her thighs met. Her fingers continued their slow movement. She felt as though she could feel every feather, that every feather was utterly sleek, utterly soft. The bird lifted its head and then stood tall again before her, and as he did, he seemed to grow in size. He grew and then turned his back to her and lay upon the sand, his wings spread and lifted. The girl, as though by instinct, stood and approached him from the side. Her feet sank in the soft, powdery sand. She straddled his back, gripped him with her legs, sank her fingers into the soft feather and held. As she did, his body shook and his soft feather moved quickly and momentarily against that of her that touched him. And then he lifted to his feet, as though she weighed no more than the air above, and turned to face the sea. With 2 steps forward and a giant retraction and extension of limb, he lifted from the ground. Long, graceful wings swept them forward to almost touch the pinnacle crests of waves. The girl lay forward, nestled her chin by the side of his neck. The gentle movement of his body beneath her, a million feathers smooth as the softest down, touched and brushed against her skin from ankles to her ear. The sun fell and the wind was warm as it swept over her with their movement. She saw the sand fall away and the water deepen with blue to give way to reef and fish of colors brilliant as those she had seen in his wings. An entire world of coral, a million forms of life within and around a giant underwater skeletal mass of living world. And then, banking sharply, the bird lifted and turned, parallel to the shore, and the girl sat up and relaxed her grip with her hands. She held firm instead with her legs, acknowledging and responding by feel alone to the rhythm of his movement beneath her. She looked over to the land. Green foliage grew as thick as moss beyond the thin white line of beach. But contrasting brilliantly with the green, bright orange birds flecked the air above, appearing and then disappearing again into the canopy of the trees. The bird flew on gently for some time, and as they flew she realized that she had lost her sense of this creature as something entirely separate from herself. She found she moved with him, rocking with his movement, lying flat against him as he climbed, leaning back softly as he glided, and then forwards, one with him as he dove. She was enchanted by the steady rhythm of their flight. Her mind fell quiet. She closed her eyes and felt the movement. She could feel through her legs his changes of direction and adjusted her balance. As he dipped and rose, her body simply swayed as grasses do when moved by subtle waves. But then he would turn sharply or would dive suddenly, only to bank and climb in a long steep arch, and her steady meditation would be interrupted by the sheer force of movement in his body and in hers. Her legs would increase their grip, squeezing into his sides, and she would extend her arms around him and feel her body awash with the sensation of the wind above and the driving soft-feathered muscle beneath. Eventually he coasted, with wings outstretched, gliding, his direction guided by subtle shifts in long tail feathers behind, and she looked up and saw an inlet, a small, protected horseshoe-shaped cove of turquoise water. The bird circled, and then in a great downward arc he coasted through the narrow opening. Spreading his wings, skimming over the surface of the still water, he landed. The girl felt the splash, up and over her feet, and then as they glided to a halt, the water reached to touch her thighs. She slid off the bird into the water, and after the long warmth of the sun, the coolness refreshed her. The flight had increased her sensitivity, and she had engrossed herself in the feeling, a feeling that was both tangible and intangible. Immersed in water, in its refreshing coolness, she looked at the bird that floated beside her and then dove to wet her hair. She then floated to the surface to lie on her back, her eyes closed. When she opened her eyes, a tied roll of leather in her lap remained where the bird had been. Svanna untied the binding and unrolled the hide. Within she found a scroll, bound to wooden spools carved at their ends with the likenesses of animal heads, one a raven, one a horse, one a wolf, and one a lion's head, with ivy that grew from its mouth to become its mane. The scroll was accompanied by a note. She recognized her brother's hand, not from any experience she could know in the bookless solitude of the garden, but rather from a sense of his energy that she could feel entwined with the form of the letters themselves, from the visual articulation, if not yet in the literal substance of the words. Svanna, I near the end. I never did find you, and whether this will perhaps I never will know. I release it to storm wind, that perhaps it may. 2 travellers visited the shrine. Their horses grazed outside beside Victus. In their hands they bore long staffs. The man's eyes went to the cups, those of the white stone, and from amongst them he chose and lifted one, handed it to the woman. At his waist hung sheathed a long spearhead of translucent black, which he took into his palm and gripped. He sliced his skin with a crystal edge, and blood fell to redden with a shimmer of gold the light of the white stone cup. She ordered me, "Drink and write." And I drank, and the water around me eddied and swirled, lifted and crashed with the voice of our Father. So, from that distant place, I took what I could glean, and set it along my own considerations with ink to paper. The result is as well as I could do from that state I entered with the red gold draft, and my mind these days is more hazy than it was, and my hand is not as fast as it was, and now too I am hurried. Soon Wolf-Father will come for me, and then it will be my time. I thought I would find you, but the game went on too long. So now I send this by Stormwind, in case you do not appear before then. They told me you were in the garden. Did you find the garden again? Or is that where you have been all this time? If so, then all is not lost, as I might still find you there. Yours, Svan.